In a quiet rural classroom, as the first bell of September fades, a hush falls over the room. Mr. Thomas, the new teacher with a warm smile and easy confidence, steps in, meeting a sea of curious and cautious eyes. He's a stranger here, eager to break the ice, but can he reach his students in a place where new faces aren't easily trusted? Mr. Thomas. Smiling. Good morning, class. My name is Mr. Thomas, and I'll be your history teacher for this year. I just moved here, so I'm still learning my way around. Hopefully, you'll bear with me while I get settled. And maybe help me with some local tips? The students remain silent. A few fidget, glancing at each other. Mr. Thomas senses the hesitation and decides to continue. All right, no pressure. Let's get to know each other. How about we go around and say your name and what you like to do outside of school? Student 1. Looking around nervously, I'm Charlie. I like fishing. Mr. Thomas. Niece, Charlie. I've never been much of a fisherman, but maybe you can teach me one day. Charlie chuckles, and Mr. Thomas smiles as he continues around the room, making brief comments with each introduction. After introductions, Mr. Thomas begins his first lesson on the importance of history, particularly focusing on understanding multiple perspectives. He introduces the concept of history from different viewpoints. A hand shoots up from the back of the class. Student 2. Aren't we just supposed to learn the facts? Like, what's on the test? Mr. Thomas. Nodding thoughtfully. Good question. Tests are definitely part of it, but history is more than just facts. It's the story of people, perspectives, and how different groups see the same events differently. The class shifts uncomfortably, and some students exchange glances. Class ends, and as the students file out, Mr. Thomas overhears some murmuring. Student 3. Whispering, he's kind of different, isn't he? Student 4. Yeah, I wonder if he'll teach us the same as the other teachers did. Mr. Thomas catches these whispers but chooses to let them go, focusing instead on his upcoming lesson plans. The next day, Mr. Thomas introduces a project on local history, asking students to research their family histories and share their findings. This brings about a few reactions. Student 5. Do you really care about what our grandparents did? Mr. Thomas. Laughing. Of course. Every family has a unique story. Sometimes understanding our family history helps us understand ourselves better. He tries to inspire them with his enthusiasm, but some students remain skeptical. During a lunch break, Mr. Thomas eats alone in the teacher's lounge. A colleague, Ms. Ridley, approaches him. Ms. Ridley. How's the class going so far? Mr. Thomas. Well, it's an adjustment for all of us, I think. They're a bit unsure of me, but I'm working on it. Ms. Ridley. This town doesn't get many new teachers. You're different from what they're used to. Mr. Thomas. I'm starting to notice, but I'm here to teach, and hopefully, I'll make a positive impression. Later in the week, Mr. Thomas begins a lesson on cultural contributions, discussing different cultures' influence on the country. A student raises a hand. Student 6. Why do we have to learn about that? Isn't American history just American? Mr. Thomas. Smiling. Good question. Think of it like this. Imagine building a house. You wouldn't just need one tool, right? You'd need a bunch of tools. History's a bit like that. Every culture adds something important to the whole picture. A few students nod thoughtfully, though some still look unconvinced. After school, Mr. Thomas stays behind, arranging papers. A student, Emma, approaches him nervously. Emma. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas. Looking up, pleasantly surprised. Yes, Emma. What's on your mind? Emma. I don't know. My dad says we don't need to focus on all this different perspectives stuff. But I kind of like hearing it. It's different, but good different. Mr. Thomas. Smiling. I'm glad you think so, Emma. History should make us think and feel. Thank you for saying that. As he leaves the school, Mr. Thomas takes a deep breath, contemplating the challenges he'll face in the coming months. He realizes he has a long road ahead, but he's determined to continue trying to make a difference. Mr. Thomas prepares for his lesson the following week. He brings in books and articles from diverse authors, hoping to broaden the students' perspectives on history. When the students arrive, he notices a few parents hovering at the door, whispering and watching him curiously. He acknowledges them politely before starting the class. Mr. Thomas. All right, class. Today we're going to talk about perspective. Think of it as seeing the world through someone else's eyes. This week, you'll each choose a historical figure. Someone from a different background than yours. Your job will be to find out how they saw the world. Student 7. Raising her hand hesitantly. Why do we need to do that? I mean, don't we just need to know what happened? Mr. Thomas. Good question. If we only look at one side of history, we miss out on understanding the whole picture. Knowing different viewpoints can help us understand why things happened the way they did. Trust me, it'll make history feel more real. He tries to engage the students with enthusiasm, but some still look skeptical. The bell rings, and Mr. Thomas catches a few students glancing back at the parents outside the door. A bit concerned, he decides to stay behind after class to see if any of them approach him. Later that afternoon, Mr. Thomas meets with the principal, Mr. Harlan, who sits him down with a serious look on his face. Principal Harlan. Mr. Thomas, I wanted to check in on how you're settling in. I understand some parents have questions about the content you're bringing to the classroom. Mr. Thomas. Staying calm. I'm aware. Some parents were watching me teach today. I'm just trying to offer the students a broader perspective. Principal Harlan. I understand your approach, but these parents are used to a certain traditional method. Maybe ease into these perspectives, focus on the basics first. Mr. Thomas. I believe understanding history fully means exploring diverse voices, but I'll do my best to balance it out. They exchange a tense but respectful look, both understanding the challenge but seeing it from different perspectives. The next day, Mr. Thomas decides to bring a personal touch to his lessons, using stories from his own family's history to illustrate how different cultures influence the larger narrative. As he shares his grandfather's experiences, he notices a few students leaning forward, intrigued. Mr. Thomas. My grandfather always told me that history isn't just in books, it's in our stories. He grew up during a time when certain doors were closed to people like him, but he didn't let that stop him. He worked hard and made a difference. That's why I believe every story matters. A hand goes up in the back. It's Emma, the student who had spoken to him after school in the first act. Emma. Did it feel strange to learn that about your grandfather? Like, knowing he went through so much? Mr. Thomas. It did at first, but then I realized it's part of who I am. Understanding his struggles helped me see my own world differently. And hopefully, sharing it helps you see history as more than just names and dates. There's a thoughtful silence in the room, and Mr. Thomas feels a sense of progress, however small. Later that day, Mr. Thomas receives a visit from Ms. Ridley, who's concerned about some students feeling uncomfortable with the material. She speaks gently but is clearly uneasy. Ms. Ridley. I think what you're doing is, well, it's new. But I'm afraid you might be pushing a bit hard. Some of the kids are saying you're focusing on things that don't feel relevant to them. Mr. Thomas. I understand, but isn't part of learning seeing things from new perspectives? I'm here to challenge them, to help them grow. Ms. Ridley. Maybe so. Just remember, this is a small town. Folks here like their comfort zones. I'm just worried about how some parents might react if this keeps up. Mr. Thomas appreciates her candor but feels a pang of frustration. He thanks her and assures her he'll be thoughtful in his approach. In the next class, Mr. Thomas decides to hold an open discussion about the purpose of studying history from multiple viewpoints. He hopes it'll help students feel more comfortable sharing their thoughts and concerns. Mr. Thomas. All right, I want to hear from you. Why do you think we study history? What's the point? Student 8. To know what happened so we don't repeat mistakes. Mr. Thomas. Exactly. And sometimes, seeing a mistake requires looking at it from every angle. You see, history isn't just about what happened. It's about how people felt, why they acted the way they did, and how that affects us today. Another student, Sarah, raises her hand. Sarah. But what if I just want to know the facts? I don't see why we have to go into so many perspectives. Mr. Thomas. Gently, it's like watching a play. If you only see one side of the stage, you miss a lot. But if you look from every angle, you understand the whole story. Some students seem to grasp his message, though a few still look unconvinced. Mr. Thomas realizes he's planting seeds that might take time to grow. After school, Mr. Thomas stays late, grading papers. He sees a note left on his desk. It reads, "Thank you for sharing your family's story. I never thought history could be like that." There's no name, but he feels encouraged. The next day, he brings the note to class as a way of opening up a conversation. Mr. Thomas. Someone left this for me, and I wanted to share it. This note is why I love teaching. It reminds me that learning is about more than just facts. It's about connecting with each other's experiences. The class is silent, and some students look moved. Emma, in particular, watches him with new respect, feeling inspired by his passion. At the end of the week, Mr. Thomas assigns a project where students will interview a family member or community elder and learn about a historical event from their perspective. He hopes this assignment will bridge the gap between what he's teaching and their lives. Mr. Thomas. Remember, this isn't just an assignment. It's a chance to learn about your own history. Maybe your family members have stories you haven't heard before. The bell rings, and students pack up, some excitedly discussing who they'll interview. Others seem unsure, but Mr. Thomas senses a gradual shift in their openness. As he leaves the school that evening, he feels a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The path he's chosen is challenging, but he feels he's made a small breakthrough. Outside, he sees Emma waiting for her ride. She approaches him. Emma. Mr. Thomas, my grandpa said he'd talk to me about something he went through. I don't know what he'll say, but I'm excited. Mr. Thomas. Smiling warmly. That's wonderful, Emma. Sometimes the best way to learn about ourselves is to learn about the people who came before us. As he watches Emma leave, Mr. Thomas feels encouraged, knowing that at least a few of his students are beginning to see the value in his approach. It's a chilly morning, and Mr. Thomas is preparing for his lesson on civil rights history, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. He knows this topic might be controversial, but he believes it's important. When the class starts, he begins with a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. written on the board. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Mr. Thomas. Today, we're going to explore how social movements have shaped our history. I want you to think about this quote as we discuss the civil rights movement and its impact. What do you think it means? A few students look uncomfortable, while others appear intrigued. Emma raises her hand. Emma. I think it means that if we ignore something wrong in one place, it could happen somewhere else, too. Mr. Thomas. Exactly. Understanding history means understanding how these movements have affected all of us. He starts discussing key figures and events, aiming to engage the class with stories rather than just facts. Midway through, a student, Brad, raises his hand with a skeptical look. Brad. Why do we have to learn this stuff? It's all about problems that don't even exist anymore. Isn't it enough to know that things change? Mr. Thomas. Calmly. That's a fair question, Brad. But history helps us understand the roots of those changes. It's not just about knowing that things are different now, but about knowing why they changed and who was affected by them. Brad crosses his arms, clearly dissatisfied. Mr. Thomas senses he's losing a few students' attention and tries to refocus the conversation. After class, Mr. Thomas overhears Brad talking to a group of friends. Brad. I don't get why we have to go through all this depressing stuff. It's like he's trying to make us feel guilty for things that happened forever ago. Mr. Thomas feels a pang of frustration but chooses to let it go, focusing instead on those students who seemed engaged. However, he senses an undercurrent of resistance that's beginning to take root. The next day, Mr. Thomas is called to a meeting with the principal and a few members of the school board. They look at him with a mix of politeness and tension. Principal Harlan. Mr. Thomas, we've received a few complaints from parents regarding your recent lessons. They feel you're focusing too much on topics that some of them find uncomfortable. Board Member 1. We appreciate your dedication, Mr. Thomas, but we have a curriculum for a reason. Parents expect a certain consistency. Perhaps you could stick to more straightforward, traditional topics? Mr. Thomas. Holding back frustration. With all due respect, history is full of difficult topics. Avoiding them doesn't mean they didn't happen. I want my students to think critically and understand all aspects of history. Principal Harlan. We understand your perspective. Just try to keep things balanced. We don't want to alienate the community. Mr. Thomas leaves the meeting feeling both discouraged and determined, realizing that his efforts to bring broader perspectives are under scrutiny. That afternoon, Mr. Thomas's lesson on social justice continues, but he can feel a slight tension in the room. As he begins discussing historical injustices, Brad speaks up again, this time with more defiance. Brad. Look, not everyone's family was involved in all that. My grandpa says that we shouldn't have to feel bad for things we didn't do. This is just making us all look bad for no reason. Mr. Thomas. Brad, I understand that it can feel uncomfortable, but learning about the past isn't about blame. It's about awareness. If we know where we came from, we can make better choices for the future. Brad. Well, maybe some people just like being angry about the past. A few students snicker, and the atmosphere grows tense. Mr. Thomas remains calm but feels the divide growing. He knows he's touching a nerve with some students, but he can't help but feel he's reaching others, even if it's difficult. At lunch, Mr. Thomas is approached by Emma, who looks upset. Emma. Mr. Thomas, I wanted to say that I appreciate what you're teaching. I talked to my grandpa like you suggested, and he told me stories about things I didn't know happened. But some of the other students, they're saying things behind your back. Mr. Thomas. Thank you for telling me, Emma. I know it's hard. Learning new things sometimes makes people uncomfortable, especially if it challenges what they thought they knew. Emma nods, looking reassured, but Mr. Thomas feels the weight of the growing conflict in the classroom. He's glad Emma and a few others are seeing the value in his lessons, but he worries about the students resisting. The following week, things escalate. Mr. Thomas is discussing a civil rights figure when Brad, visibly agitated, interrupts him. Brad. This is ridiculous. You're acting like people in our town are still racist or something. We're not responsible for what happened back then. Mr. Thomas. I understand, Brad. No one here is responsible for what happened in the past, but understanding it helps us prevent similar issues in the future. Brad stands up, shaking his head. Brad. This is just a waste of time. My dad says this is all just politics, and it's not what we're supposed to be learning. The class falls silent, shocked by Brad's outburst. Mr. Thomas is hurt but tries to keep his composure. Mr. Thomas. Brad, I know this is challenging, but history is about understanding where we come from. I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty, only to help us all see a fuller picture. Brad storms out of the room, and Mr. Thomas feels the tension settle like a weight over the room. He's unsure how to continue but takes a deep breath and finishes the lesson, sensing the class's discomfort. After school, Mr. Thomas is called to the principal's office again, where a visibly upset Principal Harlan awaits him. Principal Harlan. Mr. Thomas, Brad's parents are furious. They're saying you're bringing in too many controversial issues. They're even talking about escalating this to the school board. Mr. Thomas. Taking a deep breath. I'm not trying to make waves, Principal Harlan. I'm just teaching history. I want my students to think critically and to see how history affects their lives. Principal Harlan. I know, but this town, it's traditional. People don't like being made to feel uncomfortable. I need you to tone it down, Mr. Thomas. Stick closer to the textbook, please. I don't want things to get out of hand. Mr. Thomas feels frustrated and defeated but nods reluctantly, understanding the pressures at play. In the days that follow, Mr. Thomas scales back his lessons, sticking closer to the textbook, as requested. But he notices that some students, particularly those who had been inspired, now seem disappointed. Emma approaches him after class one day. Emma. Mr. Thomas, are you okay? Your lessons feel different lately. I liked it when you talked about things that really mattered. Mr. Thomas. I'm just trying to find a balance, Emma. Sometimes doing what we think is right isn't easy, and it doesn't always please everyone. But I'm glad you found meaning in what we talked about. Emma nods, understanding but sad, as she realizes her teacher is struggling against forces beyond his control. A week later, the incident comes to a head when Brad's parents confront Mr. Thomas after school in the hallway. Brad's father is visibly angry, and his mother looks equally upset. Brad's father. Mr. Thomas, my son tells me you're filling his head with nonsense, making him feel guilty for things that don't matter anymore. We don't want this agenda pushed on our kids. Mr. Thomas. Trying to stay calm, sir. I assure you, I'm only trying to teach history in a way that's engaging and relevant. I want my students to see all sides of the story. Brad's mother. We don't need new sides. Just stick to the facts and keep your opinions out of it. The confrontation leaves Mr. Thomas feeling worn and defeated. He goes home that evening, questioning whether he's truly making a difference or just creating tension. It's a tense morning as Mr. Thomas prepares for class, aware that there's a growing divide among his students and their families. He decides to introduce a lesson on empathy, hoping it might ease the tension in the room. He writes a quote by Maya Angelou on the board. "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." Mr. Thomas. Good morning, everyone. Today, I want us to focus on something that unites us all, despite our differences. Empathy. Being able to see things from someone else's perspective is one of the most powerful tools we have. Some students nod, but a few, including Brad, look irritated. Brad rolls his eyes, and Mr. Thomas notices but tries to keep the class engaged. Mr. Thomas. Let's try something new. I want each of you to write down a moment when you felt misunderstood or judged unfairly. No need to share it unless you're comfortable, but it's an exercise in seeing ourselves through others' eyes. A murmur runs through the room, and students begin writing. Mr. Thomas walks around, peeking at a few papers and offering encouragement. Brad, however, doesn't write anything and stares defiantly at his desk. During the activity, Brad mutters something under his breath. Mr. Thomas notices and gently approaches him. Mr. Thomas. Brad, is everything all right? Brad. Loudly. I just don't see why we have to do this. It's pointless. This class is supposed to be about history, not feelings. Some students look up, sensing tension. Mr. Thomas takes a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Mr. Thomas. History is made up of people and their experiences. Understanding emotions and perspectives is part of understanding history. Brad. Rolling his eyes. Yeah, well, not everyone agrees with you. Maybe some of us just don't care. Mr. Thomas feels the weight of Brad's resistance but decides not to push him further. He continues with the activity, though a heaviness settles over the class. After class, as Mr. Thomas packs up his things, he finds that Brad has left a note on his desk. It reads, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" Mr. Thomas stares at it, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He crumples the note in his hand, unsure whether to report it or confront Brad. That evening, he confides in Ms. Ridley, who tries to comfort him. Ms. Ridley. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I knew some students were unhappy, but I never thought it would get this personal. Mr. Thomas. I don't know if I'm getting through to them at all. It feels like every time I make progress, something pulls me back. Ms. Ridley. Some of us see what you're doing, and we support you. Don't let this one student get to you. Mr. Thomas nods, but he can't shake the feeling of frustration and isolation. He goes home that night, feeling more determined but also deeply troubled. Scene 4. The next day, Mr. Thomas decides to continue with the empathy exercises, hoping to reach the students who are still open to his approach. As he's explaining the assignment, Brad speaks up again, this time with open hostility. Brad. Why do we even have to listen to you? You're just trying to push your own views on us. Mr. Thomas. Trying to remain calm. Brad, if you have concerns about the class, I'd be happy to talk with you after. But right now, we're in the middle of an assignment, and I'd like you to respect the space. Brad. Respect? You don't respect us. You're just here to tell us how wrong we all are. The tension builds as some students look uncomfortable, and others watch in silence. Emma tries to intervene. Emma. Brad, he's just teaching. You don't have to agree with everything he says. Brad. Scoffing, oh, so now we're all supposed to agree with everything he says? This is just messed up. Mr. Thomas feels the tension hit a breaking point, unsure of how to de-escalate the situation without compromising his integrity. Later that day, the incident reaches the school administration. Principal Harlan calls Mr. Thomas in and sits him down with a grim expression. Principal Harlan. Mr. Thomas, I'm aware of what happened in your classroom. Brad's parents they're angry. They're saying you're bringing personal views into the classroom and creating a hostile environment. Mr. Thomas. Frustrated, I'm just trying to teach history in a way that connects to their lives. Principal Harlan. I never wanted this to become a conflict. Principal Harlan. I believe you, but Brad's family is influential in the community, and they're threatening to go public with this. We can't have the school's reputation compromised. Mr. Thomas. So what are you saying? That I can't teach history fully, just because it's uncomfortable? Principal Harlan. I'm saying maybe it's time to consider a different approach. We don't want to lose you, but if this keeps up, my hands may be tied. Mr. Thomas leaves the office feeling the weight of the situation. He knows he's on thin ice and feels torn between his dedication to his students and the fear of losing his job. The tension reaches a climax when, a few days later, Brad's parents organize a meeting at the school, inviting other parents and community members to discuss Mr. Thomas's teaching methods. Mr. Thomas attends, determined to defend himself but nervous about the response. Brad's father: "We're here because our kids are coming home with ideas that don't align with our values. We don't need someone coming in and making our kids feel like they should be ashamed of their heritage." Mr. Thomas: standing up, calmly but firmly, "With all due respect, my intention has never been to make anyone feel ashamed. I'm simply teaching history as it happened, in all its complexities. Understanding different perspectives helps us understand ourselves better." Parent 1: "But our kids are saying they feel uncomfortable in your class. Don't you think that means something?" Mr. Thomas: "Learning can be uncomfortable. History isn't always easy to face. But that discomfort can lead to growth and understanding." The crowd murmurs, some supportive but others clearly displeased. Emma's parents speak up in his defense. Emma's mother: "Our daughter has learned so much from Mr. Thomas's class. She's thinking critically, and she's become more empathetic. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about?" The room becomes divided, with some parents nodding in agreement and others looking increasingly frustrated. Mr. Thomas feels encouraged by the support, but the tension is palpable. After the meeting, Mr. Thomas feels drained but grateful for the support he received. However, the pressure from Brad's family and a few other vocal parents leaves a mark. The next day, Brad confronts him in the hallway, his voice laced with resentment. "Brad, happy now? You got everyone all worked up. My dad says people like you just like causing trouble." Mr. Thomas: "Brad, my goal was never to cause trouble. I just want my students to learn and grow." Brad: "Yeah, well, maybe some of us don't want to grow the way you think we should." Mr. Thomas watches as Brad walks away, feeling both saddened and frustrated, knowing that he may never reach certain students. That evening, Mr. Thomas reflects on his journey at the school. He contemplates leaving, feeling disheartened by the backlash and unsure if his efforts have made any difference. But as he's preparing his resignation letter, he receives an email from Emma's parents, thanking him for the impact he's had on Emma and assuring him that his lessons have given her a new sense of empathy and awareness. Moved, he reconsiders his decision, realizing that even if he's reached only a few students, those connections are meaningful. He decides to stay and continue teaching, though he knows it will be an uphill battle. Following the intense meeting and the turbulent events, Mr. Thomas starts feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He decides to hold an optional after-school discussion, inviting students, parents, and teachers to join in a conversation about empathy, history, and understanding different perspectives. He hopes it will create an opportunity for open dialogue. A few students, including Emma and some curious parents, attend, along with Ms. Ridley for support. Mr. Thomas: "Thank you all for coming. I wanted to create a space where we could openly discuss any questions or concerns. My goal in teaching is to help my students learn, not just about history but about understanding each other, and I'd love to hear your thoughts." The room is quiet for a moment before Emma raises her hand. Emma: "I think your lessons made me see history differently. I talked to my grandpa about things he never told me before. I didn't understand why you wanted us to learn all that, but now I think I get it." Emma's mother: "We were hesitant at first, Mr. Thomas. But I think Emma's right. She's learned to see the world in a way I never did at her age, and I think that's valuable." A few parents nod, but others still look uncertain. Mr. Thomas smiles, grateful for Emma's courage in speaking up. After the meeting, a few parents approach Mr. Thomas privately. One of them, Mrs. Carson, expresses her reservations. Mrs. Carson: "Mr. Thomas, I respect your intentions, but some of us just don't want our kids to feel pressured into seeing things differently. We value our traditions." Mr. Thomas: "I understand, Mrs. Carson. My goal isn't to change anyone's values, but rather to show that history is complex and multifaceted. It's about helping our children understand all parts of our story, so they can make their own informed choices." Mrs. Carson: "I'll try to keep an open mind, but it's hard when the world keeps changing so fast." Mr. Thomas: "I get that. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges what we've known. Thank you for speaking with me openly." Mrs. Carson nods, and although still hesitant, She seems more willing to give his approach a chance. The next day, Mr. Thomas decides to take a different approach in class. He sets aside the usual lesson plan and instead organizes a group activity where students discuss their family histories and share any unique stories they learned. At first, students are hesitant, but slowly they begin to open up. Student 9. My grandpa told me about how his family moved here during the Dust Bowl. One never knew they had to leave everything behind. Emma. My grandpa went through something similar but for different reasons. I never knew he felt like an outsider in his own town. Mr. Thomas. See? Every story we share brings us closer to understanding each other. History isn't just what happened, it's how it shaped our families, our towns, and even us. The students seem more relaxed, engaged in each other's stories, and Mr. Thomas feels a sense of fulfillment as he sees them connecting over shared experiences. After class, Brad approaches Mr. Thomas with an expression of discomfort, as if struggling to say something. Mr. Thomas braces himself, expecting more resistance, but Brad surprises him. Brad. Mr. Thomas, I talked to my dad, and he told me some things I didn't know. I still don't agree with everything you say, but maybe there's more to it than I thought. Mr. Thomas. Surprised, smiling. Thank you for saying that, Brad. I'm not here to make you agree with me, only to think about things in a new way. I appreciate you being open. Brad. Yeah, well, I guess there's more than one way to see things. Brad walks away, leaving Mr. Thomas with a glimmer of hope that perhaps even the most resistant students are starting to reconsider their perspectives. In the days that follow, Mr. Thomas sees a positive shift in the classroom. Students are more engaged, asking questions and sharing their own family histories with curiosity and respect. Even those who were previously resistant seem to participate more willingly. Mr. Thomas feels a renewed sense of purpose and realizes he has reached his students, even if only gradually. During a class on cultural contributions to American history, Emma asks a question that leads to a thoughtful discussion. Emma. Mr. Thomas, do you think it's possible for people who are so different to really understand each other? Mr. Thomas. It's possible, but it takes effort. Empathy is a choice. We don't have to agree, but if we're willing to listen, we can find common ground. The students seem thoughtful, and the classroom feels transformed as they delve into an open, honest discussion. Mr. Thomas feels a profound sense of accomplishment. As the semester comes to a close, Mr. Thomas assigns a final project where each student shares a historical figure or story that resonates with them. When it's Emma's turn, she stands proudly in front of the class. Emma. I chose to research someone who fought for civil rights, just like Mr. Thomas taught us about, but I also learned about my grandpa, who stood up for people when he thought something was unfair. He never told me before, but I think, learning this helped me see him in a new way. The class applauds, and Mr. Thomas feels moved, realizing the profound impact his lessons have had on Emma and perhaps others as well. On the last day of school, students gather around Mr. Thomas to thank him. Emma presents him with a card signed by the class, each note expressing gratitude for helping them see history in a new light. Mr. Thomas is deeply touched, holding back tears as he reads the card aloud to himself. Emma. We wanted you to know that even if we didn't always say it, you made a difference. You showed us that history isn't just in books, it's in us. The students exchange goodbyes, and Mr. Thomas realizes that, despite the challenges, he's made a lasting impact on their lives. Later, Mr. Thomas stands alone in his empty classroom, looking around and reflecting on his journey. He feels a mix of gratitude and pride, knowing that he has managed to plant seeds of understanding in his students. Ms. Ridley stops by to say goodbye. Ms. Ridley. You did it, Thomas. You stayed true to yourself, even when it wasn't easy. Mr. Thomas. I guess sometimes the hardest path is the one that makes the most difference. Ms. Ridley nods, smiling as they share a quiet moment, both proud of the work they've done. As Mr. Thomas leaves the school for the last time, he sees Emma standing outside, waiting to say goodbye. She gives him a small gift. A framed picture of the class with a handwritten note that reads, "Thank you for teaching us to see the world through new eyes." Emma. I'll never forget your class, Mr. Thomas. You helped me see things differently, and I think, maybe I'll keep looking at the world that way. Mr. Thomas. Smiling, deeply moved. Thank you, Emma. Remember, it's up to you to keep that vision alive. As he walks away, Mr. Thomas feels a sense of closure, knowing that his time in this small town wasn't in vain. The impact of his teaching will stay with his students, shaping the way they view the world for years to come. The last day of school arrives, and Mr. Thomas enters his classroom one final time. He finds it hard to believe his journey here is coming to an end. As he looks around at the empty desks, he reflects on the challenges and small victories he's had over the past year. He's surprised to find that he feels a bittersweet pride, knowing he made a difference, even if only for a few. Emma and a few students enter, holding a small wrapped gift and a card. They shyly approach him, eager but a bit emotional. Emma. Mr. Thomas, we all pitched in to get you something. We wanted to say thank you for everything. You taught us more than history. You taught us how to see things differently. Mr. Thomas. Smiling warmly. Thank you, Emma. I didn't realize how much you all would teach me in return. I'm so grateful for each of you. He opens the gift, revealing a leather-bound journal. Inside, students have written messages of gratitude and personal reflections on what they learned throughout the year. Emma. We thought you could use this to keep track of the next part of your journey. Every teacher should have a story to tell, right? Mr. Thomas. Overwhelmed. This means the world to me. Thank you all so much. Remember, the story doesn't end here. Keep exploring, asking questions, and seeing the world with open eyes. After his goodbyes with the students, Mr. Thomas heads to the principal's office for one last meeting with Principal Harlan, who's waiting with a look of respect and quiet admiration. Principal Harlan. Mr. Thomas, I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know I respect the dedication you brought to our school. I think, in some ways, you opened all our eyes. Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Principal Harlan. I never wanted to be a disruption. I just hoped to show these kids that history is more than facts. It's a way to understand ourselves. Principal Harlan. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I hope you know your efforts weren't in vain. Good luck with whatever comes next. They shake hands, and Mr. Thomas feels a sense of closure, knowing he's leaving a positive mark, even with those who once resisted his approach. After leaving the principal's office, Mr. Thomas heads to his car. He sees Ms. Ridley waiting outside to say goodbye, along with a few students who wave as they walk by. Ms. Ridley. Well, it looks like this is it, Thomas. It's been inspiring watching you push through everything. You really left an impression here. Mr. Thomas. I couldn't have done it without allies like you, Ms. Ridley. Thanks for always being there, even when things got tough. Ms. Ridley. Some of us need to be reminded of the importance of empathy, too. You reminded all of us why we got into teaching in the first place. They share a hug, and Ms. Ridley hands him a small, handwritten note with a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. Mr. Thomas smiles, touched by the gesture, and places the note carefully into the journal his students gave him. As Mr. Thomas drives away from the school, he reflects on the past year. He sees familiar landmarks, recalling both difficult and uplifting memories. He pulls over for a moment to take it all in, feeling a quiet sense of pride and accomplishment. He came to this town hoping to make a difference, to teach not just history but understanding, and though he faced resistance, he leaves knowing that he's changed at least a few hearts. Perhaps that's how change always begins. One story, one connection, one student at a time. The scene shifts to a new classroom, 1 year later. Emma, now a year older, stands in front of her own classmates. She holds a presentation on the civil rights leader she researched the previous year and shares what she learned with passion and poise. Emma. And I believe that understanding our history helps us grow. It's what my teacher, Mr. Thomas, taught me. That history is more than just names and dates. It's about people, about who we are. Her classmates listen attentively, some even inspired by her dedication and insight. In this moment, it's clear that Mr. Thomas's influence has had a lasting impact on Emma, sparking a curiosity and empathy that will stay with her. Back to Mr. Thomas, who's now teaching in a new school. The classroom is more diverse, and he feels a renewed sense of energy and possibility. On his desk is the journal his former students gave him, which he uses to jot down observations and reflections. He glances at it before beginning his first lesson. Mr. Thomas. All right, class. Let's start with a question. What does it mean to truly understand history? He notices a few students looking at him with curiosity and enthusiasm, reminding him of the journey he's been on. He smiles, realizing he's exactly where he's meant to be. Sometimes, we plant seeds we may never see grow. But for those willing to listen, the roots of understanding can run deep. And in a world that changes with every generation, perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all.